During the pandemic, the need to develop therapeutic approaches became critical, and so they need to study them in a structured way to critically evaluate their effectiveness. So, innovative strategies to conduct clinical trials under difficult circumstances were sorely required. Today, we will discuss this strategy with some people who actually created them. The objectives of this podcast is to understand the main challenges to conduct clinical trials in the middle of a pandemic, both in a developed and a developing world, discuss strategies for patient recruitment and evaluation, and deliberate on future strategies to study new therapies for emerging pathogens. Welcome to Editors in Conversations. This episode is brought to you by the Antimicrobial Agents and Chemotherapy Journal, available at aac.asm.org. I'm your host, Cesar Arias, Editor-in-Chief of AAC, and this podcast is supported by the American Society for Microbiology, who publishes AAC. Don't forget to check our latest issue available at aac.asm.org. We actually have a new web platform that you will enjoy very much. And you will find outstanding papers on resistance, susceptibility, pharmacology of antimicrobial agents, epidemiology, and clinical therapeutics, among others. Today, our guests we have very special guests today to discuss this particular topic. Is Dr. David Boulware, Professor of Medicine of Infectious Diseases at the University of Minnesota, and Eduardo López-Medina, Assistant Professor of Pediatrics at Universidad del Valle in Cali, Colombia, and Director of the Pediatric Infectious Disease at Centro Medico Imbanaco in Cali, Colombia. Welcome, gentlemen, to Editors in Conversations. I want to first, before we get into the real matter of the podcast, we are recording now in June 2021. So how are we doing with the pandemic, David, in the United States? Let's start with you in the United States. What is your opinion how we're doing right now?
In the United States, things are obviously looking up. The cases are down, across the U.S., even in places, with high vaccination rates and without high vaccination rates. And so I think we're, it's not quite a dream come true, but like from a year ago, things are dramatically better and really have improved a lot over the last 6 months. But, the U.S. is somewhat of an island. And so internationally, the situation is much different.
Yeah. And with that, Eduardo, how are we doing in Colombia?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're not doing that good. So we're going through a bad wave. We're going through a third wave of the pandemic. The last one was at the end of December, at the beginning of January of this year. And at that point, we were having approximately 20,000 cases of positive, PCR positive. SARS-CoV-2, and right now we're around 30,000 cases every day, with approximately 100,000 deaths overall. We're seeing 600 deaths every day. ICUs are up to near 100% of capacity. So we're not doing that good. I think that so we hope to improve sometime soon because the vaccination rates are going up. However, we are still only close to 10% with 2 doses, but they're going up really, really fast now that we have access to different platforms, including several from the US and from the UK, Astra, Janssen, Pfizer, etc. So I think that, I'm optimistic that we should improve, but right now things are difficult.
Thank you, Eduardo, for that optimistic view. I'm hoping to visit my family soon, which I haven't been able to do in more than 16 months. Right. So let's go back to a year ago when we were hit sort of from March, April, June, entering a very bad summer last year, where people started, probably undermining many of the problems that this pandemic was going. And there was this therapies that were, touted by, many people, and including our leaders at the time. And you, David, took the task to evaluate that and in an incredible manner, I think. So let's start with your experience. Tell us what happened and how did you do it?
Yeah, so we were, I was actually coming back from an NIH study section, and on March 9th, basically, there was community spread happening. And on a Monday morning, I called my team together. And we were supposed to all go to the CROI, the CROI HIV conference in Boston. That was canceled. And so we had 4 days blocked out from our schedule, which we never, 4 days of free time, like that never happens. And so at that point, it was obvious community spread was happening. This was going to get much worse. And I emailed some contacts at NIH and said, hey, are you doing anything with outpatient therapy? Because for post-exposure prophylaxis or early treatment, is there anything NIH is doing? And the answer was basically no, not at that time. They were really focused on getting the remdesivir trial up and running, which was a success. But the challenge was no one was doing anything. So we're like, well, you kind of look around and like, someone should do something. And so we decided that someone was us.
And then what did you do? Because this is where the interesting part of the story comes.
Yeah, and so on March, Monday morning, March 9th, we basically said, okay, we're going to do a post-exposure prophylaxis trial with hydroxychloroquine. We chose that because there was some in vitro data. We knew it. I worked with hydroxychloroquine on HIV and some other things in the past, which didn't work. But we knew that there was some antiviral activity in lab situations, but we didn't know what that would translate to humans. And we thought that this was, it's an available medicine, it's safe, and we should study it. This was early March, before it became political, before it was a thing. And so we're going to start this trial. And so we wrote a protocol in about 24 hours. We sent it to an IRB. We sent it off to FDA within about 3 days. I ordered the medicine. I basically took, some of my own money to order the medicine. So we'd have a supply, because we realized hey, people are going to figure out that this hydroxychloroquine, this might actually work. And so there's not going to be any drug available. And so let's get the drug. And we built a database, within a couple of days. And basically by the next Monday, we were ready to go. The IRB approved it. FDA called us up and said, hey, we want to talk to you, go for it. And so the stars aligned of actually rapidly getting this up and running. And so we started on March 17th, so 8 days later, we started. And within a couple of days, we realized a lot of people were already getting sick, but by the time they were after post-exposure prophylaxis. And so by March 22nd, we had expanded it and redone a protocol amendments and back to FDA about doing early treatment as well. And so we had basically a post-exposure prophylaxis and an early treatment trial up and running. There was an internet-based study.
So yeah, we're going to get into that in a minute, as how you started recruiting patients, which is another very interesting part of the story. So let's go back to South America, Eduardo. So, no remdesivir yet. So we are basically this year, after we've learned in the developed world about remdesivir and, thanks to David, about not using chloroquine and all that, the steroids study. But of course, there was no people in South America started using things. And one of the top drugs that came up in every single country in Latin America was ivermectin. So ivermectin was being used a lot. And then you decided to study this. And I know the difficulty that there was, particularly in that middle of the pandemic. So similar to David, tell us what your experience and how you started this trial and how did you do it?
Yeah, so it began approximately 1 month later than what David just told us. It was at the beginning of April. And at that point, a paper came out in antiviral research. And it was an in vitro study. And they took some viral cells and they infected viral cells and bathed them with 5 micromoles of ivermectin. And they showed that within 48 hours, the concentration of viral RNA decreased 5,000 times. So that was very interesting. And then a few weeks later, a couple of preprint or a couple of papers that were posted on a preprint server showed also a stunning results. That was an observational study that used propensity score matching, but it showed that in critically ill patients that were intubated and in really bad shape, the use of ivermectin reduced the mortality with an hazard ratio of 0.2. So very important and big effect. So at that point, we thought the same. There is something that needs to be done. We need an outpatient therapy, something that is easy to get and and that may have some impact. And looking at that observational data with this and the in vitro data, and the fact that ivermectin had been used for other viral infections, including yellow fever, dengue, Zika, with controversial results, we decided to take a look at it. It wasn't as fast as what David just told us. It was a longer process. Here in Colombia, when you do a clinical trial, you had to go to the national regulatory agency after going through a local ethics committee. So it took more time. But eventually,
sorry to interrupt. I want to hear about that because so David has an incredible organizational skills and able to launch these things, because there were many people trying to do what David wanted to do, and he beat them all basically. And so I know how difficult this is in Colombia. There's no resources, there's no structure, there is no money to buy the drug as David did, for example. So tell us a little bit about what were the challenges during this process, particularly in a country like Colombia?
Yeah, well, challenges, there were many. There were many challenges. So I think that, probably the first challenge was that although we are in a research site that is called SAFE. SAFE means in English as a Center for Infectious Disease Research. We are a freestanding research site, and we have many years of clinical trials, experience doing clinical trials, mainly in vaccines, but also in therapeutics and other trials. So we do have the experience, but we have never done it in the midst of a pandemic with a highly contagious virus that is potentially lethal. And that was particularly important, taking into account that at the time that we were planning the trial, again, we're talking about June or so of last year, there was not enough information on prevention strategies. So the team was quite nervous about moving forward. And then the other major difficulty that we had is that we wanted to see and evaluate the patients in the first few days of symptoms. So back then, we didn't have a rapid antigen testing, and the PCR was taking a long time to come back. So it was difficult to find the patient with symptoms, had a positive PCR, confirmatory PCR, and we had the result, all of that within 7 days. So that was quite challenging. Eventually, the State Department jumped in and helped us, giving us a list of positive patients every day. So we could find them from there. We made phone calls, and we found the patients from that list with the early symptoms.
And who paid for the trial?
So we did. I mean, the SAFE, this research site, we have done other trials that without funding. The research, the site pays for some of those trials, and the site has funding from the different studies, even NIH-funded studies or the university-based studies, the Trasher Fund, industry-sponsored studies. So SAFE has that capacity to fund some trials that are of public health interest.
Great. David, let's go back to your experience, and I want you to tell us the way you recruited patients, because you really use some innovative tools in the middle of the pandemic that are really an example of how to do this thing efficiently, quickly, and practically. So tell us your story. It's fascinating.
Well, when we started the trial, we didn't have any money. And so, but we're like, we'll apply for some NIH grants. We'll get some money. It'll all get worked out. So, but we didn't have any money. And so the question was, how do you do a trial, fairly inexpensively, but pragmatically to actually get the clinically important answer that you care about? And so at the time, there was a shortage of PPE, as you recall. And so, basically no inpatient research was going to happen. And so it was like, how could you do this remotely then? And so we decided, well, let's do a remote trial. And so we'll basically recruit people over the internet. We'll see if they're eligible, and then we'll see what happens to them. And so for the post-exposure prophylaxis trial, it's fairly simple, because it was really a lot of the people enrolled were healthcare workers or family members of sick contacts. And so they all started healthy. And so the major clinical question was, did they get sick? And so if you have a healthy person, they get no symptoms, don't develop any symptoms, that's great. And so you just ask people, like, how are you doing? Do you have any COVID symptoms? And so it was very pragmatic, clinically oriented of, asking did they get sick and then did they get tested. Back in March and April, there was really so little testing available, which is still shockingly, even for healthcare workers who got sick. They're like, just go home and quarantine. We assume you have COVID. Come back in 2 weeks. And so it was ridiculously how bad the testing was. And so a lot of people couldn't get testing. And so even within our trial, 2/3 of people were healthcare workers. The majority of them could not get testing because they weren't sick enough to be hospitalized. And so, basically we sent out a number of internet-based, surveys, emails, or text messages to follow up with people, asking what symptoms they had. And the majority of people did well. They didn't have any symptoms. They took the medicine and nothing happened. But there's about 15% of people who did get sick. And so we asked what symptoms they had. Did they get tested? Did they get hospitalized, et cetera? And so that was the post-exposure prophylaxis trial. And then for the early treatment trial, it was basically the opposite of people start out sick. And then we asked basically, how severe their symptoms were and how quickly their symptoms went away. And looking at, just the time course to when they got better and were they hospitalized, did bad things happen to them? And so it was fairly pragmatic questions of using sort of the, patient-reported outcomes. And so, do you need to see someone in person to say, are you sick? Do you have a cough? Do you have a fever? Like, most patients can answer that question. And so we were very pragmatic out of necessity because we didn't have any money originally, and we couldn't see people in person because of the restrictions of COVID.
So, David, you mentioned this. You use the internet. This is like a gross generalization, right? So tell us, what tool do you use?
Okay.
Social media. I mean, how people will respond to that?
Yeah. So I mean, the trial was run via REDCap database, and there's basically automated surveys and automated emails. And so the question was how to get people to that. And so we started with just an email address because we didn't even have time to set up a web page. And we're like, hey, if you're interested, email us and we'll send you the information. And so basically it was an out of office response, kind of automated email response back of like, here's the trial participant information sheet, and here's the URL to go to if you're interested. And so that actually worked pretty well. And then we developed a website and developed some pictures and some fancier stuff. Basically the same concept if you're interested going there. And then to get people there, we use social media. So we use Twitter, we use Facebook of physician groups to spread the word. And then like some random person I've never met in Canada who's an infectious disease doctor said, hey, can we participate? I said, sure, like here's a protocol, like, get IRB approval, get it up and running. And so we share their database. Similarly, we got inquiries from a number of colleagues in Scandinavia, from Honduras, from places in Africa, and I just shared our protocol of like, if you want to do a trial or just what treatment we're doing, here's the protocol, and run with it to try to help people and just to help people, and if they wanted to do it, they could. And so we did collaborate with some colleagues from McGill and elsewhere in a couple of different provinces in Canada. And they ran the trial in parallel, and we basically merged our data sets together. But yeah, it was through Twitter and word of mouth. And when I started the trial, I had just started on Twitter maybe like 3 or 4 months before, and I probably had like 10 followers. And so I wasn't really a big Twitter or social media person. But then we would give daily updates of what our enrollment was and what we're doing. And then now I have like 8,000 Twitter followers, and half of them probably still hate me because hydroxychloroquine doesn't work. But yeah, it was through social media that actually was useful to amplify and let other physicians know to refer patients in and refer themselves in, oftentimes when they were exposed or sick. And so that was how we recruited. And so we recruited, in total with our 3 trials on pre-exposure prophylaxis, post-exposure prophylaxis, and early treatment, about 3,000 people in the span of about 6 weeks to do these trials. And the total cost of the trials was mostly FedEx bills. So it was, we basically, people enrolled and we FedExed out the medicine overnight to them. And that was the major expense of the trial. Most of the personnel costs were covered by grants that we weren't working on because of the pandemic. And it was fairly, short 6 weeks of a lot of work. But then we're done.
Phenomenal story. So Eduardo, so in countries like Colombia, there is no culture of clinical trials. People are somehow skeptical to being studied. And of course, in case of desperations here, that might change. So what was your experience in patient recruitment in Colombia?
Yeah, it was difficult because we were interested in patients with mild symptoms. So we had to focus on the outpatient setting, and different to with the story that he just told us, we did have to visit patients in their homes, and they were scattered throughout a large metropolitan area. And then we would get the informed consent, and also in the protocol, we had to get a liver function test because we were using a dose of ivermectin that had never been used. And so we wanted to make sure that they had baseline normal LFTs. So we would have to get the LFTs, bring them to the lab, make sure they were normal. And if so, we would go back to their homes and enroll them into the study. So that was very complicated. And we ended up, initially, we planned for a very small, team of nurses and drivers, and we ended up with a large team. So that was another, layer of complexity that we added there. People did receive the trial well. People were interested in finding out whether the medication worked or not. And the state health department helped us a lot. They did, they made public the fact that we were doing this study, and they were interested, and they were supporting us. So that helped a lot. So in the end, it was the recruitment was easy, and people wanted to participate. As soon as we called them, they were aware that this trial was going on, and they jumped in.
Wow, fantastic. So let's talk about now about the results. So, David, so then you find the results are not, as some people might have expected. And I wonder, you can share if you received phone calls from the White House at that time, and tell me what was the reaction when the results start trickling in and you realize that this is not going to work.
Yeah. So as with any good trial, you do it. You don't know. You hope that it works, but there's equal poise that if you definitely know it works, you don't do the trial, then you already know it works. And so we didn't know that it was going to work or didn't work. But we thought it was worth doing a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. And so, once the trial was done, we were kind of we really wanted it. We had spent 6 weeks working on it. We really wanted it to work, but we were just happy to be done, I think, and have an answer. And so we wrote up from the time the trial stopped on a Wednesday. We wrote this up actually using Google Docs. There's about a dozen different doctors all sort of writing the manuscript at the same time. And so we wrote it up really quickly. So within 3 days, we'd written up 2 different, trial manuscripts and submitted it off to New England Journal. And, as I'm hitting send, I get this email from, the White House doctor of we hear you're doing the study on post-exposure prophylaxis. And it's oh. And so I totally didn't I didn't want to share our results with them because they would totally leak it or try to destroy it or something. I don't know. And so, but they basically asked for advice because I think the president had been exposed to COVID from his valet, and so they actually wanted some advice. And so, in good faith, I told that I did based on what I knew, I would not recommend it, but I realized that they were probably going to do it anyway. And so here would be the dose, and here were the side effect. We knew the side effect profile, and it's relatively benign, but and so. We gave some information and said, I wouldn't recommend it, but you can do what you want, sort of thing. And so we actually his doctor was actually a pretty nice guy, and we had some back and forth afterwards and stuff. And I recommended, well, if he actually did get sick, I'd actually give him a monoclonal antibody. I talked to Regeneron or Lilly to try to get him, because that actually might work, which as it turns out, it actually does for post-exposure prophylaxis or early treatment. And the second time when he got sick, they actually gave that to him. So I guess I'd like to take some credit for that, but there were a lot of other people involved. But anyway, so yeah, it was a little bit different of people involved, and so we're just doing our little academic thing, writing our paper, publishing it, and we didn't realize there was going to be such a firestorm of people really pissed off that it didn't work, and just conspiracy theories coming out of the woodwork of you got $18 from Gilead in 2018 for food at a medical conference, so therefore you're in the pocket of big pharma. And it's what are you talking about? This makes no sense. And so there was Russian trolls and other people just attacking us and attacking me. And I'm fine. I'm a academic professor of infectious disease. It's not like I'm a whatever. So they can attack me and criticize me all they want. But most of the actual serious doctor folks were quite happy that we did a randomized trial and got a result. But the non-serious, non-doctor folks were kind of mad that we didn't get the correct results. But, we do trials. We don't know what the result's going to be. And it's a double-blind trial. And so they're like, you skewed the results. It was all and it's like, dude, you don't even understand what a double-blind trial is. Like, I'm not even a statistician. It's not me doing the analysis. And so there's a lot of people that are mad, but most people got over it, or some people have not, but that's fine. They're not physicians.
And we all thank you for standing by firm in the pressure. So Eduardo, so I used to, in the middle of this, of course, I had a lot of communication with my Colombian colleagues, and they were all using ivermectin for everything. To the point that my mother actually got exposed, and I was seriously thinking about using this with no results. So what happened when the results starts coming up and you realize that this is not going to work? So were you also trolled in Twitter or emails criticizing you? What happened?
Really bad, really hard as well. Yes, and I still am actually. I get these messages that are very sort of threatening and insulting messages, but yeah, that's life, that's research, I guess. So yeah, people were also very disappointed. Actually, the mayor of my city of Cali, he was a big supporter of ivermectin, and before we did the trial, he was recommending it for massive use. They bought a lot of ivermectin, and it was very difficult to find it in the pharmacies. Similar to David's experience, we had to buy it beforehand, so we could have some drug to the trial. So when the data came out, I actually, I told him beforehand, listen, this is what we're gonna say, and the media was very interested, and they knew that we had the results, and they were calling us constantly. So what's the data? Give us the results. So we went to the mayor and we told him, listen, these are the results. And he was like, just don't show the data, not yet. Just give us a minute. Let us sort of work things through. But we thought that it was important, and people were, self-medicating and actually getting intoxicated from it. So we didn't wait. We had this press conference and we released the results. And yes, so people, as David just mentioned, non-scientific people, non-medical people, are still very concerned that our results showed what they did, and we get not so many anymore, but we did at the beginning many messages that were quite nasty.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean most of my work is in cryptococcal meningitis, and so I'm not used to getting hate mail, and so this is a new experience of getting hate mail and threats and this and that, and it's just it's kind of sad.
Yeah,
I think that in ivermectin, what I tell them is that, listen, the results that we showed is that for what we looked at, which is length of illness, duration of symptoms, it didn't work. But we also state very clearly in terms of other outcomes, our trial didn't look at that. So don't hate us because it didn't prevent deaths. There was only one death in the trial. You have to look at other trials if you want to answer that question. But for what our primary outcome, that's the result, and that is not going to change.
Yeah, I think oftentimes people don't read beyond either the title or even the abstract. But like, there's a lot of nuance that in a medical publication you're used to discussing, and all of that is lost. They're like, you said it doesn't work. Well, no, we said this in this exact situation of what we studied, the population we studied, of the dose we studied, the duration, and all of that is lost on social media.
Absolutely.
Cesar, there is another issue that is interesting, and going on that line, is that limitations. Our trial had limitations. I'm sure. I mean, most of trials, or maybe pretty much every trial, has some limitations, and we state them very, clearly in the discussion. And then we would get these hate messages. You didn't check ivermectin levels. That was a huge mistake. And we say, well, it's read the paper. It's
read
there.
The paper.
Read the paper before you send me these messages.
But this is what science is, and this is what we are living currently. We're living in a era of sort of a skepticism about the realities that we can prove. And that's why I wanted to talk to you guys, because these are really wonderful examples of people like you taking a risk and doing things that otherwise wouldn't have been done in the way that you did it. So it's really fascinating. So in the last part of the podcast, I just want to, so if you had to do it all over again, and we will have another pandemic at some point, how do we do it better? I'm thinking about things like the recovery trial. As you mentioned the word pragmatic, David, in terms to really get results that are helpful. But in the United States, we tend to be very nitpicky about things and trials and so forth that may or may not be eventually useful in this situation. So how do we do this better? And of course, we are not going to be able to change the culture sometimes, but we need to stick with the science. So what is your opinion on that?
Eduardo, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I can. What I can say is that I think that for research involving public health issues, especially when recruiting hundreds or even thousands of participants, it's important to have the support from different fronts. I mean, academic societies, key opinion leaders, public health departments, even the media are important players in this big trial. So I think that we need to improve the public awareness of the need for clinical research and the societal benefits it provides. People need to be aware that no health threat from emerging infections to non-communicable disease can be overcome without understanding them through research. And this cannot be accomplished without active participation from the community. So I think that we can improve in that. I think that we can do better in that sense, and lives can be easier. Our lives can be easier if we can do it.
Yeah, I think what Eduardo says is really good. I think one of the great things that he had was some collaboration between government and researchers. For us, we were very separate and siloed, and so government didn't want to. COVID became very political very rapidly, and so they didn't want to promote. Public health authorities didn't want to promote research because that's experimental therapies, and so we were pretty much on our own without any government support. And so it was really the support of our colleagues, of other infectious disease physicians, that were helpful. And so we ended up and got no NIH support, no U.S. government support, which was disappointing. We applied, and we applied for like four different times for various funding things, and we basically got nothing, which was disappointing because you're asking for too much money. You're asking for $200,000 to do a phase 3, nationwide trial. That's too much money. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, that's crazy. Like $200,000 is nothing for a 1,500 person randomized trial. And so I think having networks in place are good, which I think has come up. And so being able to implement platform trials in the future fairly rapidly. The U.S. still is just it's slow. It's there's a lot of paperwork and bureaucracy. Even though it's streamlined and there's urgency, that there's still a lot of bureaucracy. And so to do collaborative multi-site trials to get a quick answer is certainly the way to go, because single site studies just take too long to be conducted for the most part, unless it's really massively widespread. And so I think organization and planning and leadership, and I would say leadership being the biggest one, is key. But the U.S. is very, each institution is different. And I think that unless you have sort of collaborative partnership, it's hard to get, you can't build a network from scratch. And so utilizing some of the existing NIH networks, which are funded for various different reasons for future clinical trials in a setting of a pandemic, is the way to go. And that happened, but it just took a while to get going.
Yeah. So going back to this idea of the network, I'm talking and putting sort of the United Kingdom example. Yeah. Of course, there is a United Health system, which probably helps a lot, and compared to. So Eduardo, I know how difficult it is sometimes to collaborate in Colombia, because I've had the same experience sometimes, and it's not that different in the U.S. because so certain people just want to be the prominent. Every institution want to be the trial manager. So what would be your strategies to try to convince people or governmental agency that we need to establish a real clinical trial network that can be deployed quickly and efficiently?
I think education says. I think that this pandemic, it's been horrible for all of us, but that's something that has come out of it. The fact that we need these trials, we need these research strategies, we need to build these networks. And here in Colombia, we have actually through this pandemic, we have created a few networks, or one network that doesn't have too many people, too many heads, but there is. I mean, that's a step forward that we took, and it's just people interested in research, people interested in in science, not wanting to be the main character of all of this. They're just there to help, and there are a couple of protocols already running, going through INVIMA and all of that. That takes a while, but that's something that we have never done before, and that just came out of this. So I think that's educating, and also as I mentioned before, educating the community and the other big players in this, which I think at least here in Colombia, the government, the State Department, the public health departments can have an important roles, and I think that they are understanding it. They are every time more aware that we can do science, that although we're not as fast and we don't have that much money, we can still participate and provide and produce research here. So I think that we're in the right way, probably slower than we would think, we would like, but I think we'll get there.
David?
Well, I mean, I think I'm really impressed with what Eduardo and his team did in Cali. It's really impressive. And so I think, that particularly in low and middle income countries, that having a network of colleagues that are willing to collaborate together, you can do a lot. You can always do a lot together. That working together, and I think is key. And I think what Eduardo mentions of having, a number of people who are happy to lead, but also a lot of people who are happy to do. And so if you've got a lot of egos in the same room that all want to talk about stuff, you can debate stuff of you can debate stuff forever and not get anything done. And so I think one of the efficient things with our team is that we kind of had a working structure, and we knew kind of our strengths and weaknesses and who was good at what. And so we're able to do stuff, rapidly and delegate stuff and get stuff done, and work as a team together. And as a team accomplish a lot more than if it was just one person, or at the same time, if it was a dozen different people all sort of just talking about stuff. And so I think that's hard to kind of, what's the collaborative spirit. And so I think early in the pandemic, we ran into a lot of people that were really very collaborative and just wanted to get the answer and work together, and that worked great. And other places where it didn't work is great, because they really wanted, they were really focused on the credit or this or that, and it just didn't quite pan out as a collaborative project.
Cesar, the other thing that I would like to mention is that media has been important here.
Yeah.
The media, the communications, they have helped. They can be, catastrophic sometimes, but in this case, they have understood the fact that science is important, and that in the midst of this pandemic, it's important to fight against misinformation and fight against the social networks and all of that. Well, not against the social network, but against the misinformation that can be delivered through social networks. So they understand that they have to find someone who knows a little bit about science and medicine and follow their lead. And they have so when they approached us regarding this ivermectin trial, they were also useful in telling people that it was conducted by a team of researchers, by a team of academicians and scientists, and that it had all the ethical and regulatory aspects in place.
Gentlemen, this has been one of the most entertaining podcasts I've ever done. It's a fascinating story. You are truly heroes, and really congratulate you for your initiative, your thoughtfulness, innovative thinking, and to give us answers in a very critical moments. I hope that we've learned the lesson for the future. I hope that you can lead us to implement things so we don't have to scramble next time. So thank you very much, gentlemen. This is Cesar Arias, Editor-in-Chief of AAC, signing off.